Good evening. What I'd like to offer today is a reflection on the debate that I stumbled into in my book, dealing with the implications of Atlantic piracy for how we view the British Royal Navy and naval power more generally, and on top of that, state power in the 18th century. Okay, so our image of the Royal Navy, of naval power, and of state power. The book examines the limits of the bureaucratic reach of the British state and the limits of its governmental legitimacy, especially at sea and in coastal communities. By documenting the persistence of piracy in the face of a state-sponsored campaign to delegitimize it, the book shines a light on the nature and structure of the British state and on the economic and legal beliefs of British subjects. Now, when commenting on Atlantic piracy, historians usually see the 1720s as the endpoint of open piracy in the Atlantic, and a transition from the golden age of piracy to a golden age of privateering. And to these historians, this shift reflected the growth of British naval command in the Atlantic world as British officials on land and sea used the Royal Navy, the Customs Service, and the courts to confront, chase, capture, and execute pirates. So in the first decades of the 18th century, according to this view, naval policing was expanded from British waters to the Atlantic and Caribbean. And the Royal Navy then proceeded to suppress piracy at sea, and imperial prosecutors tried and executed them at port. And this aggressive law enforcement campaign on land and sea turned public opinion against pirates and their commercial and political backers. And so the Royal Navy and Customs Service therefore functioned as an effective police force, which in the course of a single generation, from the late 1690s to the 1720s, transformed the Atlantic from a wild frontier into an orderly venue of maritime commerce. Okay, so this is the dominant understanding of when piracy ended in the Atlantic in the 1720s. And the when indicates how it took place, how it disappeared. Okay? It happened rapidly through a forceful campaign or a forceful confrontation at sea and port. So the significance of this field of piracy studies has to do with the power and legitimacy of the British state. Because according to this historical explanation for the end of Atlantic piracy, Britain policed and pacified the ocean by force. Okay? It brought local courts and local office holders into compliance with Parliament, okay, with the central government. And it changed the commercial habits of British merchants and consumers on both sides of the ocean. Okay? Britain converted seaside communities, again in England, North America, and the Caribbean, converted them from enablers and supporters of piracy to becoming enemies of piracy. Okay? Converting British and Anglo-American port towns from communities that ignored imperial law to against piracy and ignored imperial laws that outlawed piracy, transformed them into communities that internalized imperial law and adhered to it and enforced it. And when I started my research on this, My aim was to understand why piracy disappeared in the Atlantic, but nevertheless continued, and flourished in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, okay, all the way to this day, in fact. And I followed the narrative that I just laid out for you, and what I wanted to do in my research was to simply analyze the mechanics of this civilizing conquest of the ocean and of coastal towns. So I wanted to see how, just again, technically, how heavy warships actually found and chased and captured these small and fleet and swift pirate ships. Okay, so how anti-piracy prosecutors went after local merchants and sailors and local officials for their ties with pirates. What I found were a lot of laws and regulations and proclamations and little actual action. Okay. What I found, instead of the narrative that I laid out for you, is that first, Atlantic piracy was not suppressed in the 1720s. Okay. It persisted well into the 1800s, okay, for about a century past its supposed purported demise. Second, when Atlantic piracy did disappear in the 1830s and 40s, it was not because of naval policing or naval enforcement. Economic forces, not naval force, made commerce raiding less profitable in the Atlantic, especially following the outbreak of a stable peace at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, from 1815 onward. Third, the practice of marine insurance actually bolstered piracy by insulating merchants from piracy-related losses. And fourth, the public remained happily complicit in piratical activity, in the pirate trade, throughout the 18th century, just as it had been in the 17th century during piracy's golden age. Okay. So despite increasingly harsh anti-piracy legislation, the Atlantic in the 18th century and early 19th century remained a wild frontier in which armed commerce was the norm, not the exception. And this exactly is what I'd like to discuss today. Okay? The distance between law and practice, between anti-piracy law and commercial practices at sea. Okay. So first, I will briefly outline the growing distance between statutory law and regarding piracy and commercial practice at sea and port. Second, I'll point out that this distance between imperial law and commercial practice corresponded to the physical distance between the seat of government in London and the many locations of commercial activity in the British Atlantic, which is why the government's efforts to bridge this ethical gap, or this ethical gap of commerce as practiced. The effort to bridge this gap involved attempting to bridge the geographic gap as well. Okay? The government's anti-piracy efforts involved thickening central governance in distant ports and at sea, and in fact diluting local governance in these distant communities. And last, I will suggest that we should understand anti-piracy law as a form of propaganda propaganda regarding the reach of state authority. We should see these laws as a proclamation of the British government's policy aspirations, and its presumption to jurisdiction and influence in peripheral communities. Okay? And this propaganda remained unconvincing under an imperial government that demonstrated to constituents daily that it did not actually have the capacity to enforce the law, enforce imperial law in the periphery. Okay, so with regard to the gap between law and practice, this gap is easily visible. Okay. Parliamentary statutes, laws, enacted laws, and royal proclamations and regulations from the 17th and 18th centuries stated clearly the criminality of commercial practices like piracy, wrecking, smuggling, trading with the enemy in wartime, etc. Yet imperial officials routinely complained about recalcitrant local communities, both in Britain and in America, who violated all these laws in the open. Merchants trading with the enemy in times of war, manufacturers selling military supplies in the private market rather than to government purchasing agents, massive smuggling and contraband trade, merchants in local communities giving cover to known pirates and smugglers, wrecking that went unabated despite governmental efforts at suppression, local juries and grand juries routinely acquitting accused pirates and smugglers, and local mobs violently liberating convicted pirates and smugglers and their cargoes from jail. Yeah. And this behavior, again, at sea and at port and in court, this behavior is consistent with the documented aid that colonial governors and other local officials provided to all these illegal traders. They offered them capital, intelligence, legal aid, as well as privateering commissions and royal pardons. My point is that these provincial officials were not corrupted into tolerating and participating in piracy. Okay. These local office holders simply shared the attitudes of their constituents and their neighbors on this issue. Okay. Helping and trading with freebooters and smugglers was not seen as corruption because freebooting, piracy, and smuggling were not seen as crimes. Okay. Pirates and smugglers were not part of a fringe or underground criminal subculture. They conducted their trade in the open and enjoyed material, civic, and political rewards for their service to their local economies, local communities, and local governments. So, for example, when New York's Governor Bellamont hounded pirates and their backers in the 1690s, he triggered angry responses and intense political pressures from New Yorkers and from their commercial associates in London. Local officials in New York obstructed the governor's endeavors and tried to have him removed from office, claiming that the governor was secretly working in the service of the Dutch to drive away trade from New York. And this strident opposition no doubt influenced the governors who replaced Bellamont in the 18th century to discontinue his policies. Okay. Coastal communities in New York and elsewhere across the Atlantic continued to see illegal traders as conventional and respectable merchants. And they, of course, so they resented and resisted efforts by imperial agents to hound and prosecute merchants and sea captains and sailors for engaging in what they saw as legitimate commerce. the general public opposed the central government's, the imperial government's anti-piracy campaign on economic grounds, but also on legal grounds. British and Anglo-American coastal communities believed that the sea was not governed by anyone. It was beyond the control of governments and courts of law. And even among jurists, there was a lack of clarity in the 18th and even 19th centuries as to whether governments and courts had real jurisdiction at sea, or effective jurisdiction at sea. For example, the United States Supreme Court, under the leadership of John Marshall, who you probably know was not shy at all about claiming far-ranging jurisdictions for the federal government. So Marshall's court rejected American claims to jurisdiction at sea. The court held as late as the early 19th century, the early 1800s, that activities that were outlawed by statute were in fact protected at sea, meaning that they were beyond the range of prosecution of any court. The British government tried in the 17th and 18th centuries to clarify to British subjects that these activities that I listed before were indeed crimes. The imperial government tried to convey this message by strict and harsh enforcement of its laws against piracy, smuggling, wrecking, contraband trade, etc. But these efforts by the central government proved unequal to the task. So despite ratcheting up the law enforcement and public relations campaign against pirates and wreckers and smugglers and their accomplices, and despite the increased severity of penalties imposed on those who were convicted, the government did not curtail the volume of smuggling and freebooting and piracy. In fact, the scope of illegal trade actually increased in the 18th century. So the campaign to suppress and delegitimize these trades was not successful, but it offered agents of the British state an opportunity to articulate through legislation an ideology of law and an ideology of state, and a vision of what the law should be and what the state should do. And this vision and the policies that emanated from it were actively and successfully resisted by British subjects, both high and low on the socioeconomic ladder. British communities on both sides of the Atlantic clung to a more archaic view of society, of the state, and of the law. Their resistance was prompted and fueled by economic self-interest, for sure, a quest to generate income for themselves, and a quest by local communities for cheap goods. But it was also fueled by the backward-looking and traditionalist and localist worldview of wide swaths of British society in Britain, in America, and in the Caribbean. You can see this, that this is not simply a quest for profit, a self-interested, a materially self-interested position. You can see this in the fact that this resistance to the government's anti-piracy and anti-smuggling campaign, this resistance was not merely impulsive or lawless. It was articulated in legalistic and constitutional terms. Local communities not only differed with Parliament and the Crown about the criminality of various commercial activities like smuggling and wrecking and piracy, but they also rejected the national government's claim to jurisdiction at sea and within these peripheral localities. This divergence between local communities and accepted custom on the one hand, and the national government and statutory law on the other, was particularly evident with regard to these sister industries of piracy and smuggling. So the massive scope of illegal trade reveals an early modern commercial mentality, a conviction that commerce with rivals, enemies, pirates, wreckers, and smugglers was conventional and legitimate. But it also reveals an early modern political mentality. So those involved in these trades saw themselves as law-abiding and patriotic subjects or citizens. As Governor Belmont's harsh experience in New York demonstrates, these people, the people involved in these trades, were regarded by their neighbors and families as providing local communities with cheap goods and lucrative markets. They were not seen as people who were putting their own private interests above the public good. Trade with the enemy and freebooting and smuggling were not evidence of a lack of loyalism or loyalty and patriotism. They were evidence of British people's localist view of the economy and of the state, or the empire. So despite a stream of statutes and regulations that became increasingly harsh and punitive, and despite the creation of the preventive service and the coastal blockade, and then the Coast Guard after that, and despite deputizing the Royal Navy and privateers to assist in this fight, law enforcement efforts remained inadequate to suppress these trades. Illegal trade and the black market it supported remained a key component in the British economy throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries, providing cheap goods for consumers and good jobs for hundreds of thousands of inhabitants in coastal communities. Central governments remained powerless to legislatively change local practices of commerce as late as the mid-19th century. Administrators charged with enforcing metropolitan policies at sea and distant ports in the 19th century voiced the same exact frustrations and complaints as their 17th and 18th century predecessors, with their castigating locals for conspiring en masse with criminals against the central government. You hear this in the 17th century during the golden age of piracy, and still in the 18th and still in the 19th century. So when you examine this vast gap between law and commercial practice at sea, you must keep in mind that even on land, the central government faced serious difficulties in imposing its authority, enforcing the law, providing security on roads and city streets, collecting taxes, and above all, convincing its subjects, the constituents, of the legitimacy of such efforts at centralized governance. So this was doubly true at sea and at the water's edge, where the government's reach exceeded its grasp and where its jurisdiction was highly contested and mostly ignored. Coastal villages and port towns were the point of contact between maritime commerce and the more orderly and governed commerce of landed communities. So these coastal towns exhibited the friction between the unregulated, violent nature of seaborne trade and the law enforcement and taxation policies of landed governments. The increasingly severe rhetorical, legislative, and judicial measures against illegal trade were not effective in deterring smugglers, freebooters, and their associates from these trades, but these measures reflected the growing frustration of government agencies with the open lawlessness in the country. And they also, of course, reflected the increasing financial needs of the Treasury to collect taxes on traded goods. Now, I said earlier that the government's law and order campaign was an effort to communicate to the public new standards of criminality, but by publicly punishing wrongdoers. But the limited dispersal of law enforcement agents in distant ports all over the British Atlantic undermined these efforts, or undermined this project, or simply customs officers in Britain, and even more so in the colonies, were woefully outnumbered by active smugglers, pirates, and wreckers. Customs agents were too few and too marginalized to do their job effectively. You have to remember that the post of customs officer in Britain, or the British Empire, was a thankless job involving an unattractive combination of low wages, social isolation, and high risk of suffering, of being on the receiving end of violence and prosecution. While customs authorities and courts did have intermittent or occasional success in capturing contraband cargoes and convicting smugglers and pirates, they were surrounded by a sea of illegal trade and systemic customs evasion. Communities in Britain, in British and American ports, had the power to convert anti-smuggling customs agents and other office holders through friendships, community values, peer pressure, as well as bribery and other financial incentives, backed up by or threats of violence and threats of prosecution. Customs officers were thus enticed or discouraged away from closely examining the documents and bills of sale of incoming goods. This was especially true in ports other than London, in the north and the west of England, for example. The farther away from London, the freer the trade was. Scottish and Irish ports, even more than English ones, were known for their hostility to the customs service. Ireland, in particular, operated as a de facto free trade zone. Indeed, the stark violence towards customs agents that was evident in southern England was not as prevalent in Ireland and America, because enforcement efforts in Ireland and America were so weak compared to customs enforcement efforts on the southern coast of England. And when enforcement efforts picked up in the American colonies in the 1760s, in the lead up to the American Revolution, so did violence against customs officers there. In fact, to a considerable degree, the rapid development during the 18th century of major port cities in North America and Western Britain, if you look at Philadelphia, Baltimore, Liverpool, Bristol, Glasgow, This urban growth was a product of the thriving smuggling industry in these faraway ports and the security and hospitality that these communities offered freebooters and smugglers and their partners. Because distance strained available manpower and hampered the efforts to curb and control and delegitimize illegal trade and to collect the customs, the British government took various measures to counter this, to enhance the presence of governmental enforcers at sea and in distant ports. For example, because local juries and magistrates habitually sheltered freebooters from arrest and prosecution, Parliament transferred piracy cases in 1700 from civilian courts to these vice admiralty courts. And these were military tribunals without juries. Okay, so the jury was the court, the tribunal, did not reflect local community values, it was hoped. As Britain imposed higher import and export taxes, which of course increased the ranks of illegal traders. So as Britain increased the level of taxation, the government established coastal patrols by the preventive service and also offered naval officers bounties to apprehend smugglers, especially during the 7 Years' War. And the king attracted even more enforcers to this task by issuing privateering commissions against smugglers. After the 7 Years' War, the government made these wartime policies permanent and also expanded or continued to expand the size and the mandate of the customs service. Okay. So the solution to the problem of distance was transporting or attracting more manpower to police distant localities of imperial trade. To the same end, imperial administrators also tried to change bureaucratic structures to reduce what they considered the corrupting influence of local communities on law enforcement agents and of the royal government. Basically, Parliament tightened supervision over customs agents, stipulating harsher penalties for collusion with smugglers and other illegal traders. And Parliament prohibited the appointment of officers in ports near their own places of residence. Okay, to make sure that these agents, these imperial enforcers, did not feel a sense of allegiance or a similarity in ideological or cultural affinity towards the local community. Simultaneously, Parliament also shielded customs agents from political pressure and judicial retaliation by these local communities, or from these local communities. These efforts did result in more productive tax collection during and after the 7 Years' War. But the evidence indicates that the black market in pirated and smuggled goods continued to expand. Moreover, the public continued to be highly resistant and resentful of the government's effort to delegitimize and punish freebooters, wreckers, smugglers, and contraband traders. People regarded these trades as conventional and also economically helpful to the local economy, and also to the imperial economy, but for that matter. Okay, so local communities saw these trades, these again, freebooting, wrecking, smuggling, as conventional and legal and legitimate and economically beneficial. By contrast, the notion that landed government had the jurisdiction and authority to disallow certain commercial practices at sea, people regarded that as unconventional, illegal, and also economically harmful. Now, although the campaign against illegal trade failed to convince locals to shun pirated and smuggled goods, it reveals a recognition, the campaign reveals a recognition on the part of imperial officials that a campaign against illegal trade required a public relations campaign against the commercial, legal, and moral beliefs of British subjects, okay, consumers, merchants, and local office holders. Simply outlawing certain trades by statutes was not achieving the desired results. Okay. Now, if you follow the legislation year by year, you'll see that these anti-piracy and anti-smuggling and anti-contraband statutes and regulations were reissued regularly and with escalating rhetorical ferocity. And this indicates that these laws and rules, in fact, went unheeded. Okay? We should not see these reissued laws and rules and threats as evidence of new commercial practices at sea and port. Okay, that, hey, new laws are being passed, that indicates that people are changing their economic beliefs and economic behavior. It's the opposite. Okay? The fact that these laws are reissued with intensifying ferocity are evidence of growing governmental frustration over the persistence of old practices at sea and port. Okay? And this observation, this way of reading these laws and statutes or these laws and regulations and proclamations is it's a methodological critique that legal historians and cultural historians level against historians of piracy. Okay, these legal scholars and cultural historians point out that modern observers, including these piracy specialists, these historians of piracy, have a natural tendency to project the jurisprudence and sensibilities and logic of the modern nation state in which we all live onto the 18th century. Okay? So the charge that these legal historians are making against historians of piracy is that these historians of piracy today look at 18th century anti-piracy statutes and accept them, and they accept these 18th century statutes and royal proclamations and parliamentary rhetoric against piracy, accept it at face value. Okay, that these historians of piracy accept these laws and regulations and proclamation as credible descriptions of life on board ships and in port towns and in local government bureaucracies. And if you think of it, if we adopted the same approach to the study of our own society, Just looking at the law books and extrapolating from what's written in our statutes to what's happening in our society, we would reach pretty crazy conclusions. Okay, we would conclude, based on our law books, that the government has curbed a host of social problems that in actuality we know, because we live in the society, that the government has been unable to delegitimize, let alone actually control. Take drug use and underage drinking, for example. Okay, by law, the illegality is clear. But that is not an indication of real life. So the anti-piracy statutes and official records that piracy specialists work with give a false impression of actual commercial practices at sea and port. There were two opposing legal belief systems here. Okay? English custom accommodated piracy, wrecking, and smuggling, whereas English law, English statutory law, increasingly sought to regulate and eventually abolish these, okay, these trades. But the written statutes and regulations in the archives show the scholar only one side of this ideological and political contest that was taking place in the 18th century. Okay? Most Britons and Anglo-Americans were on the other side in this debate, challenging or maybe just ignoring this parliamentary or royal ideology of the state. When historians of piracy, when historians of piracy discuss 18th century freebooting and smuggling using the language of crime, they validate the legal beliefs of Parliament and the Crown. Okay? Even though all contemporary accounts, all of them, official and unofficial, tell us clearly that British communities did not consider these trades to be criminal or disreputable even. Okay? It's the equivalent it's the equivalent of using the language of crime to discuss violations of our COVID lockdowns. Okay, so we know that there is a legal, ethical, and constitutional debate going on today regarding the legality and legitimacy of these lockdown regulations. Okay? So to refer to the accepted and conventional habit of going to church or visiting your sick parents as crimes is to accept as established law what we know is a legal novelty that is hotly debated. Okay, so regardless of where you stand on these regulations, what is clear is that it is debated hotly in society, in legislatures, and in the courts. Okay. Now, if future historians were exposed only to our state regulations on COVID lockdowns, they'd have a skewed view of how life was really lived locally in 2020, 2021. Privateering is a good example of how misleading statutory law can be in this respect. Okay? New governmental regulations in the early 18th century indicate to some scholars that privateering had become a well-regulated business from the initial license to the final decree in prize court. And it's true that privateering commissions articulated the precise boundaries of legitimate commerce rating, revealing the government's view of the legal and ethical line separating piracy, separating the pirate from the privateer. These privateering commissions offered detailed legal procedures of how to capture ships, how to bring them to port, and how to claim title to them in prize court. And then there were more acts and regulations that provided exhaustive elucidations of the terms and restrictions binding privateers. And these were supplemented by copious explanations of procedures for processing prize claims in court, addressing the protests of aggrieved proprietors, assessing competing claims, and so forth. And then privateer owners copied all this legal language, boilerplate, in their own instructions to ship captains. And admiralty courts applied such laws, regulations, and proclamations in actual cases brought before them. Okay, so piracy scholars point to all these early modern written sources as evidence that there was this robust body of legal and bureaucratic provisions to regulate, that regulated privateering. Okay. And although these historians all acknowledge in passing that such regulations were not effective at actually regulating privateers, keeping them within bounds of their commissions, they acknowledge this in passing and continue to nevertheless present the dividing line between pirate and privateer as a very real thing. So in treating statutes, privateering commissions, and royal regulations as reliable reflections of actual commercial practices at sea, these historians give credence to parliamentary and royal presumptions of authority, jurisdiction, and effectiveness on the peripheries of the British state. Even though virtually all modern scholars and all early modern observers acknowledge that it was impossible to keep privateers within the bounds of legal conduct and to prevent them from broadening their operations into piracy. Okay. People in the 17th and 18th centuries lived in pre-modern states. So they intuitively accepted as a practical and ethical reality that legalistic categories like pirate and privateer were murky and irrelevant. Whereas state authorization for commerce rating matters a great deal to the modern piracy scholar, it was a relatively hollow concept in societies that did not recognize that the government had the jurisdiction, the legal authority, and the moral legitimacy to allow or disallow armed commerce, freebooting. Okay. Now, this is not an observation that I make in hindsight from my vantage point, looking back at the 18th century. Legal scholars back then, in the 18th century, in the later 18th century even, pointed out to their students that prize law functioned as a facade, that it conjured, for people at the time, it conjured an image of order, a division between pirate and privateer, that contemporary merchants, vendors, laborers, and sailors simply did not experience. Okay? It conjures for us this image of order, but people who practiced trade, practiced commerce did not experience this this division. So so the result is that while the line that divides pirate from privateer was legally valid according to the civil law, according to statutory law, it was culturally untrue, and according to common law, also legally dubious. Okay. So what I suggest is that we should regard statutory law on these matters not as law, okay, like the law that dictates that we drive on the right side of the road, okay, but to regard it as a form of propaganda, okay, propaganda of state building. It failed in the 18th century to wash away people's attachment to local custom, common law, and local governance. But it was successful eventually. And for us historians, it creates an illusion of order that is real and sensible and credible to us, but was not real and not sensible to contemporaries back then. Okay. As legal scholars show, the law as enacted by Parliament and understood by the Crown differed from the legal beliefs as well as the informed legal opinion of wide segments of British society. Okay. Now, civil or statutory law was a tool for implementing and for explaining to the public new ideas forming in governmental circles in London in the mid-18th century about the reach and scope of parliamentary authority. And this, in fact, is why the Crown went to the trouble of publishing and disseminating proceedings of piracy trials. They wanted to disseminate these new ideas, this new ethic of what is legal and what is not legal, okay, about these trades that up until now were widely considered to be legitimate. But let us tell you that that is not the case. And here are proceedings of piracy trials to show you that this is actually a crime. Okay, so the statutory law was a tool for implementing the Crown's or the Parliament's new ideas about crime, but also a way to explain them and disseminate these ideas to the public. Okay. But on the other hand, the ease with which merchants and sailors and their associates got around the law taught the public a different lesson, and in fact, a stronger lesson. Okay. The fact that people were able to continue smuggling and wrecking and freebooting and trading in pirated and smuggled goods upheld and explained an older understanding of the law and of the state and of the proper boundary between the central government and local or central authority and local authority. We need to keep in mind that the English state had claimed sovereignty in British waters, the British seas, as it was called, since the 14th century. Okay. So successive generations of Englishmen were born, lived, and died with the recognition that regardless of the Crown's boastful rhetoric about its jurisdiction at sea, the sea was in fact free from governmental control and jurisdiction. The same was true of piracy specifically. There were many laws and royal proclamations on the books condemning freebooting and upholding state jurisdiction at sea. Okay. But successive generations of Englishmen lived with the widespread practical experience of the state's de facto impotence at sea. Okay. Commerce as practiced sent British constituents a stronger signal than any statute of the civil law as to what business practices were legal, customary, and acceptable. Common practice and common law were the primary guides as to what was constitutional. So the accepted storyline on the rise, decline, and fall of Atlantic piracy is a tale of civilization taming a wild frontier. In this case, the Atlantic. This narrative of creeping civilization imposed by state agents, state enforcers, marshals, armed forces, courts, and gallows. This narrative was meaningful and purposeful to Britons and Americans in the late 19th and in the 20th centuries. At the time, energized national governments used frontiers on land and sea to articulate the differences between the government's legitimate authority and force and the illegitimate violence wielded by individuals locally. Okay. These frontiers, okay, the peripheries, are where nation states cast themselves as agents of civilization. And they cast local challengers to state authority as illegitimate agents of violence, disorder, and crime. Now, this historical narrative of national governments monopolizing violence on their peripheries was part of the state-building project that we associate with modern nationalism. This historical narrative reflects the image and understanding of the state that we all grew up with for the past 200 years or so. Okay. But this assessment of peripheries and borderlands has been challenged since the 1990s by a growing recognition that frontier conditions in these peripheral communities, in these frontiers, in these borderlands, were in fact persistent. Okay. That national governments often acquiesced to local customs and accommodated local political arrangements and local power brokers. This borderlands scholarship suggests that although the state's monopoly on violence was articulated clearly in law, it was not accepted as legitimate, nor as a practical reality in peripheral communities, even as they accepted state sovereignty in other matters. And this reassessment of frontiers is evident in scholarship on a wide variety of topics. Okay. Studies on Roman provinces incorporate this, or can reflect this reassessment of central of law produced by the central government and real life in borderlands. Okay, so this reassessment is reflected in scholarship on Roman provinces, on medieval Europe, on the American West, on the Canadian West. Yet, I don't know why this critique has gained ground on land but not at sea. Perhaps perhaps the idea that a navy can control an ocean sounds plausible to us moderns, because there's all this documentary evidence in our archives, of laws and proclamations outlining naval rights and responsibilities at sea, explaining jurisdiction, etc. Okay, so that already conditions our mind to conceptualize the ocean as a zone of laws and jurisdictions, okay, of do's and don'ts. But also there's the special limitation that most of us have, having never been to sea. Okay, we can't really grasp how endless those expanses of water are. Okay, how much privacy these vast distances offer merchants and smugglers and traders and freebooters. Okay. And we don't know also, unless we're in the business of maritime shipping today, we don't know how chaotic maritime shipping is even today, let alone hundreds of years ago. Okay. So perhaps the vastness of the ocean is beyond our special our spatial imagination. Okay. So instead, we conceive of the ocean as a kind of a liquid extension of the land. Okay. A few years ago, some of you might remember that Malaysian airplane simply disappeared, and during the weeks and months that people looked for it, we all got a glimpse of just how impossible it is to find something out there in these oceans. Okay. Even today, with aircraft and radar and satellite, okay, let alone in the 18th century with just a fleet of sailing ships traveling at ground level. Okay. But perhaps what explains this is that our own image of the sea was shaped in the age of steam, okay, in the 19th and 20th centuries, when our industrial economies made us less familiar with life at sea, when steam technology really did make navies more effective against interlopers, and when the idea of state jurisdiction at sea went from being legally dubious or kooky to a still confused but somewhat established and somewhat acceptable legal doctrine. So fundamentally, the legitimacy that the state and statutory law enjoy in the hearts and minds of modern people, including modern piracy scholars, this legitimacy is born by first-hand experience that we all have, that the state actually does have the practical ability to monopolize violence, to disarm non-state actors, to make certain activities not only illegal, but also morally illegitimate, and to enforce unpopular statutes from border to border, and even at sea. Okay. Governments did not have this kind of credibility and legitimacy in the 18th century because they repeatedly demonstrated to constituents, through their failure to curb piracy and illegal trade, for example, they repeatedly demonstrated to constituents that they did not have the capacity to exert real power at the local level. So the law, as a form of propaganda, remained unconvincing to local communities. I once read an observation about Lord Acton's famous aphorism that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, certainly Acton was saying that wielding power over others encourages moral weakness in a ruler. But his central point was that power tends to corrupt the observer of the powerful, and specifically the historian. And it strikes me as a useful reminder on this issue of state authority and state legitimacy. Because we moderns, historians included, have been living within the modern nation state for roughly 150 years now. Okay? We're born into it, we live in it, we educate our children and students in it, and then our children and students do the same, and so on, okay, for about 4-5 generations now. Okay. We observe tremendous administrative power wielded by our government bureaucracies in virtually every facet of our lives, and literally every single day of our lives. So it's natural for us to see the symbols and language and assumptions of state power as credible. Okay. Thus, when we see in our archives this ideology of state articulated in 18th century statutes and regulations, our own experience of observing state power in our daily lives makes us credulous. It makes us believe what we see in the archives. And it obscures from us the credibility gap that 18th century people experienced between the written law and the lived custom. Thank you. So I see some questions in the chat here, so let me take them. Let me take them in order. So why is eradicating piracy so difficult even today? So look, first, the sea is a big place. So if controlling the sea or the seas is possible, which is a big if, then it's too expensive. Okay, so it's the first factor is the sea itself. It's a very big place. Second, pirates. Pirates are smugglers. Okay, all pirates are, not all smugglers are pirates, but all pirates are smugglers. Okay, the pirated goods that they bring in tax-free. So and of course, people like smugglers. Smugglers sell cheap goods to local communities. Okay? Wherever and whenever you have import taxes and trade restrictions, you'll have black markets. Okay, and these black marketeers are very popular. So the smugglers have the support of a large or significant chunk of the population. Third, trading firms are, I mentioned this about marine insurance in the 18th century, that's still true today. Trading firms are covered by insurance, so the damage of piracy is not debilitating for the victims of piracy. Okay, so all these things that I just mentioned now are true today, just as they were back in the 18th century. The only way to theoretically end piracy is to end all these conditions everywhere around the world. Okay, it cannot be done. Okay. You'd have to eliminate black markets, which means eliminating taxes everywhere, or import taxes. So look, fighting piracy is like fighting weeds in your backyard. Okay? It's a job that will never end. Okay? Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it shouldn't be done because you can't defeat piracy or eradicate piracy, but it means that if you commit yourself to doing it, you have to know that you're committing yourself to a forever project. In this case, a forever project that is also very expensive. So that has to do with the practical problems of fighting piracy. But the other thing to consider is that I think we're not as conscious of the fact that the things that we want to solve about the sea, like crime, illegal trade, etc., is part and parcel of the things we love about the sea. Okay? Cheap and effective transportation, which is responsible for the unprecedented and unanticipated drop in global poverty over the past 50 or 60 years. And the increase in global standards of living, the growth in global life expectancy, the fact that we can feed 8 or 9 billion people, the fact that we have better and more affordable cars, iPhones, computers, clothes, air travel, internet services, etc. These are all products of the freedom that characterizes maritime commerce. Okay? All these things happened when, and because the scope of maritime trade exploded over the past half century, a bit more. Okay? So I think when we target some aspects of this freedom of the sea, or freedom at sea, we also target other aspects of this freedom. Okay, so I think one reason we're frustrated by lack of progress in fighting crime at sea is that we're working at cross purposes with ourselves. Okay, yeah, so. Is the support of modern states for statutory law a feature of bureaucratic centralization, of modern states' bureaucratic centralization? So it's true that that modern society, that we differ from those 18th century people in the degree that we accept or demand, in fact, central governance in our on the local level. And we're also different from them in the legitimacy and deference that we grant statutory law. Okay. Back then, when the central government was seen as an external entity, the central government's law, meaning statutory law, was viewed with suspicion. Okay. First, just as a novelty in and of itself, and second, as the design of outsiders who don't share our circumstances and interests and values here. Okay. Unlike our local custom that does reflect our circumstances, our interests, our values. So modern life, and I don't know if it's democracy or nationalism, well, it's the same thing. Or at least democracy and nationalism have come to us hand in hand. In any case, they're inextricably linked. So this modern experience of democracy and nationalism has created a very different sense of the national government, and therefore a different attitude towards statutory law. Okay? So because we view our national governments now as a part of us, therefore the statutory law is now seen as something that we all passed, all of us within the national community. And because we are the government and the government is us, and therefore the state's law is our law. Okay, so there's been this shift in how local people view statutory law, the legitimacy that they grant it. English settlers in the New World brought with them from the mother country a localist political and cultural and legal mindset, a restrictive role of the national government in local life, in local governance, and an expansive reliance on past judicial precedents, an expansive reliance on common law. The habit of benign neglect, okay, or salutary neglect, reflected the decentralized nature of the British state, and it allowed a divergence between metropolitan opinion and legislation, meaning from London, imperial ideas and imperial legislation, and local judgment and practices. Okay, it allowed a divergence between the legal beliefs and governmental approaches in London and local judgments and local practices. In the 19th and 20th century, increasingly, that has not been our mindset or our structure of state. Okay, so definitely there is a difference in the bureaucratic centralization and therefore in the legitimacy that we grant the central government and its law. So the question is whether historians agree on the criminality of piracy. So scholars of piracy often understand piracy as or they understand the fight to suppress piracy and the contrary effort to resist anti-piracy enforcement. They see it as a legal and policy battle, that the line in this battle was drawn between, on the one hand, polite society, commercial elites, and the government, local and imperial government. Okay, on the one hand, on the one side is again polite society, the commercial elite, and the government. And on the other side of this battle line are pirate outlaws. Okay, and that the law reflected the will, values, and policy agenda of that first group. Okay, of polite society, elite merchants, and the government, local government and central government. Okay, so it's, like I said earlier, they use the language of crime to describe piracy. Okay, and therefore you have, on the one hand, polite society, respected merchants, government agents, and on the other you have pirate outlaws. And that the law reflected the attitudes of the first group, of polite society. But the evidence indicates that the battle line was drawn elsewhere, and that the law did not reflect the legal beliefs of polite society in the British public, in the commercial community, in high and low, Britain and America. And that the law didn't even reflect the legal beliefs of the bureaucratic community, meaning of the people who made up the imperial bureaucracy in London and on English coastlines, and in elsewhere in Britain and in the New World. Yeah. It was what was reflected in imperial law on piracy, in these anti-piracy imperial laws, or I forget how I started the sentence, but these laws, these anti-piracy laws, reflected Parliament's position and Parliament's understanding of law and jurisdiction. Okay, and this understanding, Parliament's view of the law and Parliament's view of state jurisdiction was countercultural. Okay? Piracy and smuggling was not rebellion against the existing order, but a continuation of conventional practices and traditional understandings of law and jurisdiction. Okay, so the battle line was drawn not between polite society and the government on the one hand and pirates on the other hand, but rather between the imperial government on the one hand and on the other, local government, local merchants, and local quote-unquote pirates and smugglers. And with my students, I often, I sometimes try to explain it, to point them to our own law books to show this divide, or to explain what's going on here, our inability to see this divide properly. Who are the two sides fighting on this issue? So if you examine our own register of statutes and regulations, state or municipal or federal, doesn't matter, you'll find many laws and regulations that list as crimes activities that people do daily. Okay? For example, some cities in America list throwing snowballs at people as, in some cities, throwing snowballs is considered assault. Okay, so the people who live in these cities, in which the law states that throwing a snowball is a crime, the people who live there know that snowball fights are technically, well, if they know that, yes, they're technically illegal on paper. Okay? Or, occasionally there's some story about some cop who tells a kid that selling lemonade without a commercial permit from the city is not proper. Okay, but we live in this society, and so through daily life we get the opposite message. Okay, all of us know that actually throwing a snowball is perfectly fine, and that a second grader selling lemonade on the street is not committing a crime. Okay, and the reason, so even if we know, usually we don't even know that it's illegal on paper. Okay, but even if you do know that on paper it says that that my daughter is committing a crime by selling lemonade, by living in this society, we get reassured that actually that's baloney. Okay, it says so on paper, but it's not real. Okay, and we get this message, we get this reassuring message by the fact that nobody that I know observes this law about snowballs or lemonade. Okay, and these lawbreakers are not thought of as criminals by their neighbors or by the cops or by the government. Okay, so if I wrote a book today about crime in America, I would be misleading my readers if I did not include this cultural context of daily life when I discuss many laws that are on the books. Okay, by telling my readers that the ancient legal habit of children throwing snowballs and selling lemonade on the street is a crime, I'm asking my readers to accept as established law what we all know is a legal novelty that is hotly rejected or universally rejected. Okay, so if I wrote that book, I'd be laughed at. You know, I'd be dismissed by readers if I discussed these activities as, you know, surging crime in America, and I included in my statistics snowball fights. Okay, but 300 years from now or 400 years from now, if I wrote this book, not today, but 300 years from now, my readers very well might believe me. Okay? Because in their world, you know, 300 years from now, maybe kids really don't have lemonade stands and don't have snowball fights. You know, because neighbors complain and the cops arrest children for it, and it, you know, it might be actually illegal. It might be illegitimate 300 years from now. Okay? So my future readers living in that society might actually believe that these laws we have on the books today are legitimate, are real laws. Okay? If I exposed these readers from the future only to the statutory law, they would have a skewed and incorrect view of how life was lived locally here in the early 21st century. And I think that's what piracy scholars have done to their readers with regard to the 18th century. Okay, they've given their readers an inflated view of the 18th century state. Okay, they quote statutes and royal proclamations and regulations delineating the criminality of commercial practices like piracy, wrecking, smuggling, and trading with the enemy in wartime. Yet we know that imperial officials routinely complained about these practices being rampant in local communities, again, in England and in the New World. Despite these laws, despite the harsh penalties they stipulated, etc. And we know that when pirates and smugglers were jailed, locals routinely liberated them from custody, or just acquitted them automatically if it ever came to court. The Board of Trade, in fact, complained that it wasn't just local mobs that did this, but pointed out that colonial judges and colonial prosecutors and governors helped illegal traders evade prosecution. And like I said, when it failed, when it did get to court, these perps were routinely acquitted by their peers, by juries. Okay. But pirate scholars present the government's severe rhetoric and harsh laws against piracy and smuggling as evidence that these trades were being combated effectively and suppressed. Okay. The truth is the opposite. Okay. The increasingly harsh rhetoric and draconian laws were a sign of the authorities' growing frustration over the fact that local communities and local office holders were able to ignore and thwart parliamentary legislation and royal instructions. Why is piracy? Why are piracy studies so hot, so popular these days? So it's true, piracy has garnered renewed interest both in the popular culture and in more academic circles over the past generation or so. I'd say from the 1990s. I think part of it, one thing that explained it is the rise of this field or this methodology of Atlantic history, because of its habit of looking beyond national histories and beyond state actors, and Okay, so I think this played a role in the interest in pirates. Similarly, I think the visibility of modern pirates, and meaning 20th, 21st century pirates, as well as the spectacular terrorist attacks of non-state organizations have certainly kind of sparked an interest in these groups, in these groups that are considered the enemies of all mankind. Okay, so these enemies of all mankind kind of pique the interest regarding past examples of it. And on both these fronts, both with Atlantic history and with kind of terrorist groups and modern pirates, pirates have always represented a challenge to states, and specifically because they challenge, they confront, they deny the state's claim to exclusive legitimate authority. Yeah, there's a very famous passage in St. Augustine's City of God, in which he tells this story, purported account of a confrontation between Alexander the Great and a captured pirate captain. And when the pirate is asked to justify his infestation of the sea, the pirate says that he and Alexander were in the same line of work. Okay, but because I do it with a small crew, I'm called the pirate, whereas you, because you have a huge navy, you're called the great emperor. Okay, but in fact, we're doing the same thing. And so St. Augustine brings up this this story to suggest or to get involved in this debate, and to say that in fact that's not true, that a king and a pirate are not equals. Okay? That there is such a thing as justified use of force and unjust use of force. Excuse me. Okay, so St. Augustine says that that there is such a thing as legitimate and illegitimate authority. And for him, it boils down to having just cause and just authority, which is dependent on being a Christian, a true Christian. But this debate that St. Augustine presents explains, or it goes to the heart of our discomfort with the construct of the state. And it's also, I think it's the reason why we're so titillated by terrorists and warlords and pirates in the Wild West, because these people, these warlords, these pirates, these terrorists, force us to, just like they forced St. Augustine or Alexander, they force us to articulate what's really different between us and them. Okay, whether their use of force is really different in terms of absolute value from our own use of force. Okay, just a few more, maybe one more. What does international law say about government's jurisdiction at sea? So that's so controlling maritime traffic has been an effective naval tool against rival governments and pirates and terrorists and well, anyone. It's an effective tool because blockading a port or patrolling trade routes is relatively safe compared to combat operations on land. It can be effective in the long run because it, again, kind of asphyxiates the landed community. And it has the PR benefit of being fairly nonviolent, again, compared to combat on land. But this kind of control at sea involves a set of cultural and legal assumptions regarding state jurisdiction at sea, that, you know, a set of assumptions that legitimize and codify government's right to take over the sea, to police the sea and to conduct blockades, you know, wartime or, you know, well, different regulations explaining how it is, why it is that the government can take over the sea. And you see this, you see these assumptions on display when in international conflicts. For example, when NATO was conducting military operations against Serbia, these operations included a naval blockade. There was also a naval blockade of Libya by NATO. Israel had a naval blockade of Gaza during its war with Gaza. Efforts by various, you know, by the US and some other international actors or states, efforts to police pirate-infested waters off the coast of East Africa and Southeast Asia as well. Debates about oil exploration rights in the China Seas or in the Arctic Ocean. So in these instances, you see an international legal debate about, you know, how to explain a state's right to, or how to delineate and legally justify a state policing the sea. And so these episodes reveal the ways in which war and other forms of international conflict force modern societies and governments and legal scholars to articulate exactly their views of the sea in relation to state sovereignty, in the same way that I told you about John Marshall's court. Okay. And the question for us today is the same as it was back then, of what exactly is the sea? Is the sea an extension of the geopolitical world order? Is it some sort of a commons that we all own together somehow? Is it a no man's land where nobody, you know, we don't own it together, nobody owns it at all? Or is it some sort of untidy and undefined mix of these? Okay, some sort of mixed understanding of everything I just mentioned. And so the answer to your question is that we still haven't settled this issue. Okay, whenever these episodes come up, you'll see that the nature of the debate is very, well, that in these debates, we're still trying to reach a common understanding of what exactly the sea is. And it's unsettled, and I think it's as unsettled today. Well, it's very mixed today. Okay, it's like I said, in the 18th century, it was this novel and countercultural idea, whereas today it's not countercultural. It's just that there's vast disagreement about how to understand the sea in relation to state authority. So thank you very much for your time. We've reached the round hour, so probably a good time to stop and say goodnight. Thank you. Bye-bye.